Hello and welcome to the Leadership Learned podcast, brought to you by the Inspirational Development Group. Each episode we examine the behaviours, skills and attributes required to improve human performance through effective leadership. We discuss the latest thinking and issues affecting leadership from the classroom to the boardroom, to provide tangible insights as we go beyond the clichés to prove that leaders are made, not born. In this episode, we're talking about self-awareness. Who the hell are you? And why is it important for you as a leader to find out? Well, as we will be discussing today, good leadership starts with the self. We often talk on this podcast about the importance of truly knowing your team, but it is as important, if not more so, for you to find out what your drivers are, what your strengths and weaknesses are, and even what your beliefs are. Because as we will come on to talk about in this episode, there's a very good chance that you don't actually have the full picture. People tend to learn their behaviours from what they see around them and from what they aspire to, but don't necessarily think about how well those things fit with their own personal makeup. Today we will talk about how you can get the aforementioned full picture and why that's important not only for you as a leader, but also in working out the best fit for your career trajectory. I'm your host, Matthew Moore, and this week I'm joined by our regular contributors, experienced leadership guru Nigel Girling, and youth leadership development expert Dr. Rona McKenzie. And I started the discussion by asking Rona to tell us a bit more about why we're talking today about self-awareness and why it's relevant for leaders.
I think much of what we read, particularly in the press or in journals or on LinkedIn, focuses on leadership, assuming that that's where you start. And I believe that that's almost the end point, and there's many other things we need to do first. And I think irrespective of where you intend to go in your life, whatever direction, the thing that we need to do first, almost that foundational skill, that building block, is around knowing ourselves better. And I think that the younger we can do that, the better. So the earlier we become comfortable with not just that kind of inner reflection, because that's just one side of a multifaceted viewpoint, but the more we can start to be able to get to know who we are and how we show up in the world and how we're seen by others. Yeah, earlier we can do that, the better.
Nigel, what do you think is the importance, how important is it for leaders to look within themselves?
Well, firstly, I agree with everything that Rona just said. And my additional bit would be that I think for a lot of leaders for years, because we give it that title and we make it sound so important, they all think somehow they've got to behave differently to the way they naturally would. They adopt an approach, a way of doing things. They might have observed it in successful other people. They might have had role models at home that kind of gave them some conditioning of what good looks like and how to behave. But none of it is really authentic, and there's loads of stuff out there about authentic leadership, and a lot of it is hokum. But the bit about it that matters, I guess, is that understanding that who you really are is the core of everything you do. So how do you find out who you really are? Like, a lot of people don't. Is my experience. And a lot of leaders, particularly as they move up in organizations, you can watch their persona changing as they progress. Because each level they get to, they think, oh, now I need to be like this. Now I've got to be commanding and austere and distant and have professional distance. I remember having that. Rona, you must remember that from our teacher training days many years ago. That professional distance was why it was okay to be horrible to people because they weren't as important as you.
Wow,
nonsense. It's just all nonsense. So that's why we're talking about this, to try and undo some of that nonsense and get to the reality.
So that's quite easy to say, of course, know yourself, but it is quite difficult to have an objective viewpoint of who you are and what motivates you and what your behaviours are. How do people go about that then, Rona? How can they go about looking at themselves in an objective way?
Yeah, I think when we talk about knowing our people, in terms of the people we work with, the people in our lives, often others think that's that kind of, if we take the onion analogy, we're looking at the outside and what they look like physically and what they sound like. And then we get into whether they've got a family or animals or preferences in terms of hobbies and food and whatever. And we're stripping back much, much further than that. So at the core of it is, what do we really value? What values do we hold dearly? What motivates us? What gets us up in the morning? What behaviors do we typically display? And knowing what that feels like to us, and also then how other people view us. So the whole navel gazing piece is, it's important to be reflective. I always say that the two most important characteristics we can hold are curiosity and reflectiveness, because without those two, we're not going to learn anything new, and we're not going to think about what it means for us and others. But beyond that, it's then around knowing, where will we find this information out? How can we access the things about us that they're not written down anywhere? We don't just, trip it out of our mouths because it's common knowledge, but actually internally we do. I was on a coaching course last week, another level of our coaching qualification, and most of our conversations were around the hidden values when we're coaching. People say things, and when you ask the big questions, they suddenly realize that actually, because they value people, that's what drives their behavior, or because they value high standards, and so on. And so actually, when they're starting to explain what they're doing, if a good coach will ask great questions that helps them to understand that that's actually a core value of mine, and that's why it matters to me so much. And actually, that's why that other person's behavior has upset me so much, and it seemed irrational, but actually it's because it's struck on one of my core values. And so often I find that I'm always curious about the things that light a little bit of a fire underneath me, make me feel a little bit cross or prickly, because what it's telling me is that's pushing a button for me on a value that really matters. What is that? What's that telling me? What can I learn from that? What might I do differently? And so I can do that work myself and maybe with a coach, but I'm only seeing part of the picture. So actually, I don't know what Nigel sees, or what you see, or what others outside the organisation see, people that know me or don't, that they're the bits you can't see. And so there's some work to find out about ourselves, maybe with a coach, to use some psychometrics to find out information that starts a conversation. So not just a psychometric to stick it on a shelf, but to start a conversation with a coach that says, my psychometric tells me that I don't like parties. Yeah, it's not a surprise to me, but so what? What does that mean?
What does it mean? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then what does it mean for others? Because actually the whole party piece is quite interesting for me. I don't like parties, right? I don't. But my colleague Ian is going to be 50. And I will be at his celebration, not because I like parties, but because I love him as my colleague. And I want to celebrate his birthday with him because of him. So whilst I don't like the parties, it doesn't mean I don't like people. And so I think it's the interesting understanding of what things are telling us, and then what they mean to us, and then what that will mean to the way we behave and interact with other people.
What you've touched on there is the kind of assumptions that people make about other people and about themselves, without really digging into it and thinking about it. I think that curiosity and reflection that you talked about earlier, curiosity has to be about ourselves as well. Some people have no desire to open that door. And maybe it's because they're afraid of what they'll find, or because they've learned that that's not a good thing to do. It's unacceptable. The whole British thing about the stiff upper lip and kind of putting on the veneer. I've always thought it's why we like uniforms so much. It's protection. Just like you look at a lot of people's offices pre-COVID, and they'd have the big desk and the long way to the door. And it's not because they think that's being important, although that'll be a part of it. It's often they want a protection. It's a fence for keeping people away. And so much of what people do in work is designed specifically to avoid reflection and self-awareness. They want to keep it away at all costs because they've been taught to believe, or conditioned to believe, that that's not a good place to be. And that worries me on so many levels. It took me a long time, till I was 117, to work out what it was that really drove me. And I had a kind of an epiphany about it only probably a couple of years ago, when I realized that I'm actually driven, above all else, to understand. I'm not driven to do anything, right? It's driven colleagues and my bosses mad for 50 years. I'm not driven to do anything. I'm driven to understand stuff. I want to know why. So, curiosity is in my core. So when we work on anything, we're looking at something, I want to understand why. But we've been promoting for 30 or 40 years people who are driven to act.
Mm. And how did you find that out? How did you find it out in those simple terms that, how did you get it into that sentence?
Distillation, I guess, over a very long period of the things that the Rose talked about, lots of different aspects of feedback and different aspects of assessment, and a lot of reflection and a lot of conversations with people, because curiosity, reflection, you could add as a third leg to that tripod, constructive feedback, because that drives both the others, doesn't it? To some extent, that in a lot of organizations you don't really get that. You might get a critique, or you might get instruction, or you might get transactional interaction, but do you get constructive feedback? We struggle with that, I think, as a species, but particularly I think in the UK we seem to struggle with that, where we're kind of hidebound by politeness that prevents people from giving feedback. So we tell people lies in order to make them feel better and us not feel uncomfortable. And what it actually leads to is inauthenticity in both of us. And so there's I think there's a lot of stuff here. I found out who I really was, as far as I've got, at least, who I really was, by hundreds of hours of analysis of various sorts. I've completed about, I don't know, maybe 30 psychometric assessments of different sorts. I'm one of the most assessed human beings on the planet from years of heading up an assessment center company, because I was the control sample for every new assessment we took on. So I've done most of them at some time or another, and learned to believe some of them and to think that others are nonsense, probably because they told me things I didn't want to hear. But I'm driven by a desire to find out more, whatever it is. So I want to know why.
So we're saying it's not a short-term thing. This is a very long-term thing. This is something that you need to keep coming back to time and time again. But where's a good place to start with it, Rona?
It's sad, isn't it? Because I think lots of things we learn over time, and then the older versions of us go, God, if only I'd known that when I was younger. And then we tell the younger generation and they go, shush, old woman, what do you know? You're old. I think, damn it, you're meant to listen to us. Yeah. And so actually, the bit that motivates me is to think about how we can shortcut this for young people to help them to learn earlier on. And equally, people in all stages of life, how can we help them to become more self-aware whenever the time is right for them? And I think, just back to Nigel's point, I do feel that people think that learning about themselves means that we see all facets of us, what we might call the good and the ugly, maybe not so bad, but that can feel deeply uncomfortable. And to admit, to be vulnerable in any way, to show any kind of potential weakness in someone else's eyes, is not something that people are necessarily comfortable with. So I think it's first of all about being in a place that says there's no right and wrong, good or bad. We're just people. We're all sorts of different flavors in some way of behaviors and values. So it's about just getting comfortable with the fact that this is us and this is how we show up. And there are ways that we can show up in a more productive and effective way than others. And so if we really understand ourselves, that helps us to do so. And so I think, first of all, is some of those psychometrics that Nigel mentioned. You find having a coach who's comfortable with psychometrics and analysis, and having that starting conversation of, I've just done Hogan as an example, not promoting it in particular, but I just did it last week, using it as a tool, looking at how we might use it with transitioning from school.
Sorry, what exactly is Hogan?
So it's a psychometric assessment.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite a complicated one, right, and I know little about it yet. I'm just in the early days of learning. What I do know is it was so hard to do because it kept making me give an answer and I didn't want to. It was making me choose between liking and not liking parties. And there was a bit of me that wanted to go, but I do love people, but no, I hate parties. So it's not that black and white in the questioning, but it's forcing you to make a call. The questions are excellent.
And is it just a general sort of personality psychometric?
Nigel probably knows more about this than me.
Yeah, Bob Hogan was the professor of psychology at Johns Hopkins in the States, and is a kind of a bit of a guru in the whole behavioral personality self-awareness world. And so that the Hogan assessments are quite unusual in that they go into far more depth than a lot of the ones. And you probably wouldn't start there. You probably would want to start with something simpler like DISC or something like that before you got to there, just so you had a basis for understanding what you just found out. Otherwise, if you want to try to go straight to Hogan, it would be overwhelming for some people.
Gotcha. Okay.
Sorry, carry on.
No, and so I started with print and found that really useful. As Nigel said, that helped me to understand the conditions under which I would thrive. And that they might be at home, at work. I know that if you micromanage me, you don't get the best from me. If you set me targets based on making money, you don't get the best from me. It's not what drives me. So that can, that's a good point Nigel made there. It's around having a coach that knows the psychometrics that can help you pick one that's right for you as a starting point. And I'm down the line now where I've learned quite a lot about myself, and I'm deeply curious to understand how I can put myself in a position where I can show up in the best way for other people's benefit more than anything. And that's because that's one of my motivators, is about other people. But that in the conversation, then it allows you to unpick. So what does that mean for me? What does it tell me about me? What does that look like? And then the coach might invite some 360 feedback, or to work with particular trusted family members or colleagues or whoever to have the deeper conversation of, well, what does it look like from the outside? Because I always say to the young people we work with, you stand in your shoes and you can just see you down and up and maybe a bit of reflection in a mirror, but you can never see all the way around, and you don't know what others see from their perspective. And so it can be helpful for someone else to say, actually, what I see in you is this. Did you know that? And what I appreciate about you is X and Y, which can come as a surprise. And then they can also say, oh, yeah, I've noticed that under pressure, you do tend to do X or Y. Okay. And what would be more helpful for you? Now, if you really get people, you know that their perspective is exactly that. It's their perspective, not the truth, not the answer. It's just one of many perspectives. We all have our unique map of the world based on our life's history. And so it's not that someone else has got the answer, it's that everyone's got a different answer. And what we're trying to work out is what's authentically us, so that we feel like we're genuinely being us and comfortable and getting the best from us and from others as a result, rather than, as Nigel said, trying to behave differently because we saw someone else do it. We read it on Instagram and it sounded cool. Somebody wrote it in a journal article and it's got to be the next fangled thing. Actually, it's not about that. It's about really knowing what drives us. And I think the motivators and value part for me is really interesting. Then when you catch yourself behaving differently, and those moments where you do something, you think, what's going on with me today? This is not, doesn't feel quite like me, but it clearly is. There's normally that something's triggered you and it's helping you understand what that might look like. But people do find this difficult. It's uncomfortable. It can be uncomfortable. We're far better at pointing the finger at others, going, oh, she's a bit grumpy or he's a bit this, rather than helping you to understand why other people behave in that way. What's happened there? Being a bit kinder and a bit more generous. So what we would do for others, we want to be doing for ourselves first. Because once we know ourselves, we can put ourselves in a great position to then work more effectively with other people.
Going back to your point, Matt, about this being a long-term thing, what I think it is a progression.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not that you find out one thing and then you find out something different that's contradictory. It's building the picture over the whole of your life. And I've found out all kinds of things that, taking Rona's point, things that I was quite uncomfortable about me and the way I behave in certain circumstances. I've always had a tendency throughout my adult life to toy with people. It's a mischief thing, because my brain works really fast and I understand things quickly. I get incredibly bored incredibly fast when I'm dealing with other people who don't move as fast as I do. And my response to that has often been the devil makes work for idle hands. It's been messing with people for my own amusement, and I kind of stopped doing that. I think it was yesterday, actually, sometime.
Plus two.
So it's only on pause. Yeah, it's only on pause. It'll be back. Probably a few years ago, when I got a bit of feedback from somebody I knew and cared about and trusted about the destructive impact that can have, which honestly had never really occurred to me. Even though I would think of myself as being reasonably self-aware, that aspect of it hadn't really. I was doing it because I could,
Mm.
and it's interesting, isn't it? There's so many of these behaviours in us that only surface under certain conditions.
Yeah,
and that's why this is such a long-term project to understand ourselves, because these things may only occur once every 5 years.
Yeah, it's definitely that. It's around over time, developing an awareness over time. I almost see it as if it's one of those massive jigsaws with like 1,000 pieces. So you've got to start to piece them together. But also when you start building it, you can't see the picture and it's maybe a bit black and white. And as the pieces come together, the color becomes richer and then you start to see more of you. But it's not a flat jigsaw. It's one of those kind. It's 3D and it's complex. And so it's an interesting picture. But the other piece for me is around, when you talk about someone that you're reporting to and you say, what will he need to hear from me in the meeting? Oh, he's really interested in the people side of the business, so I must talk about X. Or actually, she's really interested in the numbers and the commerciality, so we must talk about Y. Well, we just think it's because they're just hung up on numbers or people. And actually, it's not that at all. It's far deeper than that. And there might be certain times when a business is struggling that someone is more concerned about the numbers. But typically, it's what's their go-to value that it sits at the core of their being. It's not just that they just woke up one day and decided they'd care about the numbers. So really understanding what motivates you and then looking at others and saying, maybe this is why they're so concerned about this. Now I know what they need from me. And now I also know when I need to put the other side across in terms of, say, they're interested in numbers. I want to talk about the people. I know that the numbers conversation is going to be easy. And then when I get in the people conversation, I've got to think about, how am I talking their language? How do I make sure it lands? So this is about knowing us to help us also know and work with others more effectively. And I think the interesting piece here is, of course, once we know more about ourselves, we talk about leadership, but I would say we don't go there yet. We then talk about followership. So how are we going to be an effective follower? Nigel and I were talking yesterday. Robert Kelly wrote the effective followership paper in 1988 when I got my first paper round. And still to this day, all these years later, no one talks about followership. Everyone talks about leadership. But the skills of effective followership are around knowing yourself, self-management, committing to the goal, being honest, giving great feedback, asking for feedback yourself. Myriad aspects of effective followership. And they are all the characteristics of effective leaders and effective partners. So if only we started from the followership lens and gently developed that capacity and then flipped what we're doing. So I say that there's followership, partnership is actually kind of effective followership, and leadership flips. It's like it's on speed. It's like dialing backwards and forwards really quickly. Because Matt, if you and I are working together in a partnership, at any given moment, one of us will be taking a little bit more of a lead than the other. And if we're really good at this partnership, when one's leading, one's following, the interchange will be almost seamless because we're on the same page, metaphorically. And so then we start to practice those skills. And then when we come to lead, actually, we're just dialing up some effective followership behaviors. It's not rocket science yet. It is, I guess.
Well, these days, rocket science is probably an app.
Yeah.
It's pretty easy. Yes, it's interesting. For me, a lot of what you're getting at there is that for a lot of people, the core is, where does their self-esteem come from? Where does it lie? If they see the goodness in themselves as being achieving goals and targets, then clearly that's going to be a thing that's going to be high on their priorities. If they see their self-esteem as being based in creativity and innovation and origination, then that's going to drive them. If they see it's in relationships and being a person that people like, that's going to drive them. And these things are so embedded and often invisible.
I think it's why sometimes people find themselves in what we might call the wrong job.
Yeah.
So they're in a business, they're doing well, they're promoted or they change responsibility, and suddenly they're not performing well. And actually, it's not that person's changed. It's that something's changed around them that's not then tapping into their core values, motivators, behaviors, and it is challenging them in some way. And so rather than saying, oh, they're not very good at that job, Actually, it's about unpicking, where did that come from? What's changed? What's different? And they're the conversations we don't take the time to have, because I still think in business, we pay lip service. People say they're all about the people and the planet and not profit. And actually, I don't, apart from a couple of businesses, Patagonia jumping to mind, most businesses start going on about people and planet, start to make a bit of money and go, oh, this is nice. Let's make more money. Yeah. People, planet, yeah. You just sit on the side for a minute while I crack on with making some cash. Yeah. And so the people just become, it's quite transactional, human resources, subordinates. They're doing the stuff of making the money. And that's when you lose people. Many people are not driven by that. And that's when you lose the people that were really effective before, but now you're not talking their language anymore. Mm. So we need to take the time and value in people. They're taking the time to know themselves and know others better, and show that through the way we measure success. How many KPIs are about partnership or followership? Very, very rarely. We want you to work together, but actually you've got a different target to you, and you've got a different number to hit than you've got. But please work together, but hit your own numbers. Thank you very much. Yeah. Well, clearly you're not going to. It's just not going to happen. And so the metrics in business on performance management or KPIs need to promote and give value to developing your self-perspective, developing relationships with others, working harmoniously in the business, and therefore achieving. Because I would argue that if you took away the numbers and you focused on that first section, the numbers would come. The money, the profit, whatever you want would come as a result of really great behavior, not because the numbers came first. It's that whole carrot and stick thing, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. There's some kind of interesting neuroscience principles in this about obliquity. The idea of achieving things sort of accidentally on the way to achieving something else.
Yeah.
John Kay wrote a really good book about this many years ago. Actually, it's often bits of it quite hard work, but the logic of it is sound. That actually there's something about the way our brains work, that if we are trying to achieve something that we believe in to our core, other stuff will fall out. But if we try and achieve that other stuff, the thing we believe in won't fall out.
Yeah.
It's got to be that way around. Yeah. So you've got to be focused on doing something that properly matters to you.
Yeah, we talk about people being seen in businesses, being heard and mattering. And that here for me is around giving them the time and space and commitment to their self-development. That's what really matters. That would make me work for you, I have to say. If anyone wants to challenge me with a new challenge in the future, I need to matter. I need to be seen and heard and valued and be valuable. And I think that most people would agree that that's pretty important to them too.
I think it's definitely the way it's going now. If you look at the what's important for most people is money and reward comes a lot further down, and people are looking more. I was reading just today about young people wanting to work less, and not wanting this whole thing of now where we live in a culture where overwork is deemed acceptable. And that's what you do to get on. I'm leadership material because I stay at work until 7 o'clock at night.
Yeah,
not necessarily. No.
Yeah. Yeah, the kids. I feel like we're in a talking the kids, but anyone that is younger than me as a kid, basically. But we're in a generation now where young people are saying work and life are integrated, not different, and there's no balance to be found. It's just about how I integrate the two in a way that suits me. So I'm managing my hours, my challenges at work in my way. That it's not necessarily about drink and drugs and looking for they're having all the objects, the materialism in the world. It feels in many ways it's more about experience and genuine connection, people mattering. And so I think if we want to employ the youngsters coming out of schools and universities now, it's about showing them that they matter and almost being a little bit kind of less like we're the ones with the jobs and the money and aren't you lucky to have one, but much more around this is our purpose. Do you want to come on the journey with us to achieve our purpose? If you do, great. I know it might not be your journey forever, but for this period of your life, you're with us. Let's make it rich and purposeful and enjoyable and rewarding. And then when you jump off this train and go and jump on another one, that's fine by me because that's what we expected. So we're moving from my mum and dad, you have one career for life. now to you may have multiple careers. And that doesn't mean that you don't value the job you have now. It means you're enjoying the one life you've got and the journey that it will take you on. So for anyone, I'm 48 now, I think for anyone my age and older, maybe 40 and over, it's challenging the way we think about work and life, so that when we're working with the 20 and 30-year-olds, we can really engage in the same conversation.
If you look at any of the stuff about the generations online, it's just full of nonsense about what Generation Z are like or what Generation X are like. There's millions of people in that lot. They're like everything. Yeah. Just like our generation was like everything. There's loads of different people in there. Yeah, because there are tendencies and there are kind of zeitgeists and there are movements. But the critical thing that's changed, isn't it, is what it is you're working for.
Yeah, there will be exactly as you say, there's all sorts of reasons and drivers and motivations. I just feel now that the work is the most important thing in life has gone. Work isn't the most important thing in life. It's about making work for you. So anyone that's my age and older says, what, Instagram influencer? That's not a job. Actually, if we relabeled it marketing or branding or commercial awareness, or actually some of the skills that they're having to develop, brand persona, or your personal brand, we could rename it and make it into an inverted commas acceptable job for anyone over 40. The world looks different. That's the thing. And it's about keeping up with that. But these young people often struggle because they don't know themselves. So the teenage hormones in the early 20s, trying to find out where your place in the world is and what you stand for and value and are motivated by. If you knew that would make life, I feel like that would accelerate things. We talk about leadership development and say that in our line of work, we can help people accelerate their way up the pipeline, so to speak, and by learning some of the skills and behaviours they need in order to succeed. And I feel like the very first thing we have to do is start with us and know us first. And then when we know how to accelerate that slightly, but we also know it's a lifelong journey. So it's not about, oh, I've learned about me, I'm done, thanks very much, tick. Yeah. It's about, I'm learning about me and I'll be learning about me till the day I die. And that's going to be a real pleasure to understand myself better and to help me understand others too. So if we take away the time pressure and the achievement and we just talk about building a richer picture, I think that's a more accurate explanation of what it is.
And as we've said, that takes courage. That definitely takes courage to find out about your true self instead of the perception you have of yourself, because it will invariably be wrong, potentially very, very wrong. But that does take a certain amount of courage. But we've touched on it a couple of times about finding the time, and I imagine there'll be a lot of people listening to this and thinking, well, how do I find the time? Because that sounds like it takes a lot of time and effort in order to get to there. So what can people do about that?
I listen to quite a lot of podcasts kind of when I'm on the move, and people will talk about what helped them. So I was listening to a podcast, someone on high performance the weekend, and he was talking about a gratitude journal. And I've tried that and I thought it didn't really work for me. Somebody else was talking about an emotions journal, tracking how they felt at different times of the day and wondering what caused that, trying to kind of look at cause and effect. So people try all sorts of different strategies, and I wouldn't poo-poo any of them. They'll all work for different people at different times. So it might well be learning about all the different ways of being able to reflect, writing things down, having key questions that are asked or key emotions that we're tracking, whatever it might be, just to almost start to catch yourself feeling things and wondering where that came from. And so looking for the cause of it, exactly that. So if every day I feel a bit grumpy, I wonder what's creating that. Where is that grumpiness coming from? Can you put your finger on it? And I do think it's really hard work to do that on your own. I feel like we're in a very privileged position that we're able to sit here now and talk about this. And I know lots of this stems from my childhood and my parents doing this with me when I was a kid, talking to me about behaviors and feelings and values and so on. Not everyone has had that opportunity or will have, but how do we start that? how do we start, basically? Where do we start? So looking at different strategies that other people are trying, having someone that we can talk to that we feel comfortable with, that we trust, not in deep and meaningfuls, but just developing the ability to ask good questions and be prepared to be a little bit vulnerable and answer truthfully about how we're feeling, and not try to answer what we think we should say, but genuinely just saying, I feel like this, and see where the conversation goes. Last week, we talked about values, as I said, on the coaching course, and some of my answers were very surprising to me. And I love it when that happens, because I think, crikey, I hadn't worked that out about myself. It seems really flipping obvious now. And it's just because I've not stopped to think about it. So carving a little bit of space in your day to stop and think about things for you. And sometimes it's yoga and meditation, or other martial arts where people find it. I find it in the swimming pool. I've been planning a presentation every morning when I get in the pool in my head. It's about where's your space, your time, your freedom, just to reflect. So there's no right and wrongs, but it's what works for you. And but committing to doing that important work, I think, is the most important thing.
Yeah. My answer to your question, Matt, would be that people who say they don't have time for things are erecting a fence to prevent having to think about it. This doesn't take any time at all. It's time you've already got. It could be happening right now. It probably is happening to all of us right now because of things that have just happened in this conversation that have triggered a thought process running in the background. Every time you get on a train or in the car or on a bus, or when you're walking down the street, when you're going to the supermarket, this can always be happening. We don't need to focus our conscious thought on picking up some tomatoes. That's a mechanical action. You can do it without focusing the conscious mind on it. This can be going on anytime. So if anybody says they haven't got time to do this, they are deliberately avoiding it.
Matt, one thing I find that's really helpful is when I'm on my own, this sounds like I'm bonkers, I say things out loud. So if something's going on, and it's triggering a response in me, and I'll talk out loud about something is really cheesing me off, and I'll try to sometimes explain to myself what I think it is, because there's something weird about hearing your own voice say things that makes you realize whether it's right or wrong. And so I'll sometimes catch myself and think, no, that's not right. That's not what I meant. Yeah. Okay. And let it go and leave it and come back to it later on when the time does feel right. But I think that's why coaching really helps, because you say things out loud, you hear your own voice, and it helps to promote thought. So if you're only on your own, doesn't mean you can't do it. You can talk out loud. Yeah. Don't do what I do. I used to listen to podcasts whilst walking during the pandemic, laugh out loud. Other people walking thought there was definitely something wrong with me. So be careful where you're doing it.
My last question was how do people get started with this, which you've gone into a lot there. And I think, we've talked a lot about coaching and psychometrics, but obviously, although both are extremely valuable, and we would obviously encourage people to do them, that is a big step. And what you've given us there is a lot of good tips for people to get started, for everything from what you were saying about the different journals you can keep to talking to yourself when there's no one around.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And the most important step of all in all of this is wanting to find out more.
Yeah.
If that is there, everything else will follow. But if you don't want to find out more about it, if you don't want to open that door, you don't want to think about those things, then nothing we say is likely to make a difference.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and something that I think you said before we started recording, Rona, was the two most important characteristics are curiosity and reflectiveness. Yeah. And that certainly sums that up. I think that's a good place to leave it. Thanks very much for your contributions today, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Learned podcast. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the topics and issues discussed today. You can find us on LinkedIn by searching Inspirational Development Group, or email us at info@inspirationaldg.com. If you want to find out more about IDG and the work we do optimizing human performance through leadership development, you can visit our website at inspirationaldevelopment.com. We'll see you next time.